So I want to continue on with our discussion on testing, and we're going to move on to E2E testing, or really the old name for it would be system testing. Now, this is actually the last set of slides that I want to walk through on this module, so I don't see myself finishing it today. So I'm going to have another lecture tomorrow morning, and I will definitely get through it by then. So really, there isn't going to be a lecture this time next week. I can start up a Zoom session if people need to discuss anything with me, but there won't be any new material. And you can see on the right there that there's a lab accompanying this topic as well. So let's work our way through these slides. I am assuming people have worked their way through this lab as well from last week. Okay. The logo there is the logo for the framework that we will be using to uh, implement end-to-end tests. It's a framework called Cypress. And so just to set the scene, when we talk about end-to-end testing stroke system testing, we're talking about testing the entire application as a whole, right? Now, what the entire application means can vary depending on the nature of the application, obviously. But if we take the scenario that probably we're interested in, it's an application that's comprised of a UI plus some sort of server-side code plus a database. Now, if we think about the web app dev module, the UI would be browser-based, the server side would be a web API, and then whatever database technology that you're using. But it could be a mobile app, it could be a desktop app. That's where the UI might be uh, running at. But either way, it's some sort of distributed application that does have a user interface, um, and it has some sort of backend, let's say. And when we're doing end-to-end testing, stroke system testing, clearly we're interested in ensuring that the functionality of the application um, is working, but we're also maybe interested in doing some sort of performance testing or stress testing. These tend to be performance testing, load testing, stress testing. They're all terms for the same thing, really. We're interested in the responsiveness of the application. Now, for this module, we're only going to be focused on functionality. And because it's a user-facing application, we're interested in the functionality purely from the user interface perspective. Does the user see on the screen what they expect to see, given that they've interacted in some way with the user interface, clicked a button, selected something from a drop-down menu, that kind of interaction. Now, there's a term I didn't mention last week, but I could well have mentioned it, and it's this term black box testing. There's two kind of approaches, I suppose you might call it, towards testing, whether that be unit testing, integration testing, system testing, doesn't matter what level of testing. There's this term black box approach versus white box approach. Where the names come from, the black box kind of symbolizes a box that you cannot see the internals of. Yeah, you don't know how it works internally, but you can interact with the box, as in, that sort of symbolizes the user inputs to the box, and the box responds in some way, you get some sort of response back. But you don't concern yourself with the internal workings of the box. Now, when we apply this to testing, we talk about having a black box approach towards testing. What that means is that you are only interested in the user's input, and the response that you get back. You're not worried about the internal workings. The alternative to black box approach is a white box approach, and the white box idea is that you can see the internal workings of the box. And when you're doing white box testing, then it's the internal workings that you're actually interested in, making sure that the various parts of the execution flow is actually happening internally. That's more the focus than the kind of user input and response. Arguably, when we do unit testing, it's more of a white box approach uh, that we are adopting, right? But certainly when it comes to end-to-end testing or system testing, it's very much a black box approach. It's just a term that we use. And of course, system testing, stroke end-to-end testing, the assumption is it's always preceded by, certainly by unit testing and maybe even subsystem testing. And so when you're doing your unit and subsystem testing, okay, you're still talking about inputs and expected outputs, but you're probably also looking at the internal workings of the different components within your application, i.e., you're taking more of a white box approach. And during unit testing, subsystem testing, i.e., white box testing, it's during those phases that you're looking at the internal workings and you're making sure that every part of the application internally is working as expected. And so, having completed unit testing and subsystem testing, you now kind of zoom out, if you like, a little bit, and you're now only interested in the overall functionality from a black box approach. I wouldn't get too hung up on all of this stuff now. It's just sort of making you familiar with some terminology as much as anything. When we're doing end-to-end testing, okay, we're taking a black box approach, but I'm saying down here that we may also be interested in what are referred to as side effects of the user input. And the simplest example of what I mean by side effect is if a particular user input to our system is meant to make, let's say, some change to an external database, then we'd want to check that that change did actually occur. So that would potentially be part of end-to-end testing as well. And if the nature of the application is such that it is distributed, which it doesn't have to be when you're doing end-to-end testing, but typically, I suppose today it is. If it is a distributed system and there is communication across the different layers of the system, then the fact that you've got some asynchronous aspect, asynchronous networking, or an asynchronous communication going on within your black box, let's say, then I guess we need to be aware of that because that can introduce delays in getting a response back from the black box, and we may need to build that into our tests. Now, fortunately, the framework that we're going to be using is going to take care of all of that for us. But before those kind of frameworks were available to us, we actually had to try and program it into our testing code. Focusing in completely on the web apps world. So the web app is our target. We have targets when we're doing unit testing. The target when we're doing end-to-end testing is the entire application. Um, and because it's a web app, it's obviously running inside a browser. So a browser has to be part of the runtime environment of our test code. And hopefully we don't have to mess around with all of the internal workings of the browser. Um, and again, the testing framework that we're going to be looking at, the Cypress framework, takes care of all of that kind of messiness for us. But again, it's functionality, obviously, that we're interested in. But because it's a web app, then things like submitting web forms, if our application does have some web forms, we need to test that they work properly. There's obviously a lot of navigation in our web app. We'd want to ensure that all the navigation links are working. If there's any kind of flows, execution flows, typical example of that is the kind of shopping cart example where you're moving from one screen to the next screen to the next screen. Um, that's what I mean by a flow. And so we would need to write tests to ensure that those flows work properly. And as well, kind of separate from all of these, we may need to actually do some sort of what is called visual testing, that the layout of each page is as we expect it to be. Now, the Cypress framework that we're going to be using is not concerned with any kind of visual testing. There are other frameworks that do that for us, but clearly visual testing would be an important part of testing a web app. In terms of the tool suite that we can use, now once upon a time, the tool suite was this kind of combination of Mocha and Chai, which we know about, and a framework called Selenium. So that was very popular in the industry for a number of years. But more recently, a framework called Cypress has come on the scene. It's an open source framework, and that's the one that we're going to use. But if you do any kind of Google searching on web app testing, then you may come across references to Selenium, but um, it's probably being taken over by the Cypress framework now at this stage. And Cypress kind of deals with a lot of the problems that were associated with the Selenium framework. So it uses Mocha and Chai. So we'll see when we start looking at Cypress testing code, it has all of those constructs that we talked about last week, the describe blocks, it blocks, and all that stuff. So it still has all of that. It has some of the Chai expectation syntax. So we can reuse all of that. Cypress itself runs its multi-platform, MIT license, open source, all of that good stuff. And I am saying here it's not suitable for visual testing. There's a framework called Percy, which is particularly good at that. But again, we don't have time to look at that. So it's purely kind of functionality. Cypress comes in the form of an NPM package. So you just NPM install it. You essentially kind of add it to your project. But it's a dev dependency rather than a runtime dependency. You don't need Cypress framework to be around when you're actually running your application. It's only when you're running your test cases. And when you run the Cypress framework for the first time, and just down here at the bottom, there are two ways that you can run the framework. There's the interactive mode and the what's called the headless mode. Um, we will be using the interactive mode in this week's lab. The headless mode is particularly useful when you want to run your end-to-end tests inside as part of a CI/CD pipeline. And obviously, that is actually very important to us. But initially, just to get too familiar with Cypress, we're going to be using it in this kind of GUI interactive mode. And so to start up the Cypress framework after you've installed it, this is the command. And when you run it for the first time within a project, then it adds various folders and files to your project. And I'm showing you what it does add over here on the left. So it creates a Cypress folder, and there are a number of subfolders within that. And it also creates a Cypress configuration file. If we look at the folder first, the main subfolder that we're interested in is a folder called E2E. And it's in there is where we put our Cypress test code. Cypress talks about test specs. See the word specs here. So a test spec is essentially a single file that contains Cypress test code. And again, there tends to be, um, well, it's up to you how you actually break up your overall specs into individual files. It's not as straightforward as unit testing. We're not going to necessarily get into that really. On the right here, then you can see I have some test spec files. By convention, the names are .spec sorry, .cy.js, sorry. I should have mentioned that Cypress is specifically for kind of JavaScript-based applications, web applications. So the file extension anyway of a spec file is .cy.js. The other folders, which we really won't be interested in, but there's a fixtures folder. That's where you could put test data if that was relevant. There's a supports folder, which is where you can write utility functions. The utility functions would be used by your test specs. So if there was some piece of code that you were repeatedly using, then you could put that into a utility function, put that function into the supports folder, and then reference it from your test specs. So as I said, really the only folder that we will be concerned with is this E2E folder. And so I've installed Cypress on within my web app project, and then I run it. Now, what does a test spec, a Cypress test spec look like? And that's what I'm showing you here. So on the left, let's suppose we've got this very simple little web app. Could be written in React or any other web framework. And it's your kind of standard to-do app. Okay. So this is meant to be a text box here. And the way this application works, there are no surprises really. You type in your to-do text here and you hit enter, and when you hit enter, your to-do is added to this list down here. So that's all the app does, right? But still, I'd like to write some tests, or a test. I guess it would only need one really, to ensure that this works. And so here's my test spec on the right. And again, we've got our describe block, our it block, and here are the Cypress, what are called Cypress statements. And the statements are all about, essentially, they're about interacting with the browser and sometimes making assertions about what you find on the browser. So if we just take them one by one, and you'd almost guess them really. This statement here, what it does is it visits, or it essentially enters that URL into the browser address bar. Okay, and the assumption now is that I've started up my web app from the command line, and my web app is running on localhost 3000. So I want to visit that URL within the browser. So hopefully when this statement executes, this should appear on in the browser tab. Obviously, there wouldn't be any to-dos. The next statement looks like what I'm doing here is I'm trying to access the input element on the browser page. That's obviously my text box. So this statement cy.get and the name of the element that you're trying to get or access within the browser, that will essentially focus the browser on this element in the view. And I'm chaining on the type method call. And so what the type method does is it essentially types this string into my text box. When the last bit here, the enter in curly brace is how we indicate the typing of the return key. Okay. So this statement here, what it should do is it should type in watch lecture, and then watch lecture should appear down here after the enter thing. The enter key has been hit. And I'm actually chaining on another type method invocation, typing this and hitting enter. So if you like, this is one entire statement. And what it's doing is it's interacting with the browser page. And all, in a sense, all that Cypress is a way of allowing us to programmatically interact with a browser page. So the next Cypress statement, what is it doing? It's first of all looking for li elements on the page. Now let's assuming the way I've implemented this. This is an unordered list. In other words, a UL list that has li elements within it. Sorry, it's an ordered list, I should say. Really, it's an ordered list with li elements within it. So cy.getLi, what that should actually return is an array of matching elements, assuming that there's more than one. Okay, so that cy.getLi should return an array of all of the li elements that's currently on the page. Now, because I typed in two to-dos, there should be two li elements on my page. And all I'm doing here then is I'm actually making some sort of an expectation statement. I'm stating that I expect that the length of what was returned by cy.get, which is an array, that the length of that array should be equal to 2, which it should be if this worked the way I expected it to work. So that's an example of a Cypress test spec. And as I've already said, it's made up of a series of statements, and each statement is concerned with locating elements within the page and possibly interacting with them. By locating, here we're trying to locate an input or a text box. Here we're interacting with that text box. Here we're trying to locate li elements, and we're not interacting with them at all, but we're making some sort of an assertion or an expectation statement about what I get back from it. I should say that the cy.get input here, that could have returned an array as well, but because there was only one text box, then that didn't arise. So arguably, this kind of syntax is somewhat declarative in nature, although that's debatable, I suppose. But the other thing you'll notice is that we're using Cypress uses this method chaining programming style a lot. So method chaining is not a Cypress thing now, it's just a programming technique. So an example of it here again is I'm invoking the get method, and whatever the get method returns, I'm then invoking another method on that. So we refer to this programming style as method chaining, as in we're chaining a series of method invocations. We're kind of connecting them to each other. But as I said, method chaining is just a programming style. It's not specific to Cypress. And so we're going to see a lot of this type of code now in this week's lab. Okay, so just elaborate a little bit on these statements. There's two parts to a statement. There's the command part, and then there's the expectation or assertion part. And the expectation part is optional. Sometimes you don't need to use it. And if we go back to the previous screen, I'm not using any expectation here. I'm not using any expectation here. The only expectation example is that. In terms of the command part, they always begin with CY. CY is just a global object that the Cypress framework declares for us. And that global object has tons and tons of methods associated with it. And we've seen a small few of them already, or possibly only one actually, two. We've seen the visit method, the get method, get here again. So we've only seen two actually, but there are loads of them. And these commands, as I've already said, they're all about trying to access particular DOM elements in the current browser page. You're familiar with the DOM, okay, Document Object Model. So the commands are all about trying to access or locate particular DOM elements within the current page and possibly interacting with that DOM element as well. Again, to go back to the previous page, here we're trying to locate an input element or a text box. Here we're interacting with it. Here we're trying to locate LI elements. We're not interacting with them though. And I'm just giving you some examples of the various commands that are available to us. So there's the get command, which we've seen already. The argument to the get command is a selector. A selector is a way of specifying what elements within the page are you looking for. Now, I have a slide on selectors in a while. So the selectors, there are different types of selectors, but on the previous page, here, my selectors are always referring to a DOM element tag, as in the input tag and the LI tag. But there are other types of selectors as well. So, and what the get method does is it gets the DOM element or elements that match the particular selector that you've specified. Okay, so it could return an array depending on what's currently displayed on the page. Contains is another command, and with the contains command, you actually specify a text string. And what that will do is your kind of text string, it will look for a DOM element that has that particular text string displayed on the screen. So again, if I go back, sorry for jumping back now. Supposing I wanted to find the manage to do element, the element that's actually displaying this piece of text. Let's supposing it's a H1 or a H2 element. I could have used the CY that contains manage to do, and what that expression would have returned is a reference to the DOM element that actually contains this text. The find method, and you give it a selector as well as its argument. And what that does, I'm saying here, is that it gets the child DOM elements kind of the current element. So if we take this example here, right, cy.getForm, what that will do is it will locate the element on the current web page that is of type form. In other words, it's a web form. And within that element, as a nested element, I'm looking for a drop-down menu, but I'm looking for the selector element within the form element. And all I'm doing here then, just to complete it, is what this is doing is it's actually interacting with the drop-down menu, and it's selecting one of the options on the drop-down menu. So find, you use find to locate an element having, first of all, located the kind of containing element or the outer element. That's find. Next doesn't take any arguments. And what that does is once you've located a particular element on the page, then you want the next element on the page after that, based on the kind of HTML. So cy.get button, let's supposing there was only one button on the page, that will locate the button element, and then I'm just getting the next DOM element after that. Of course, if cy.get button return, sorry, if cy.button returned an array, the dot next really doesn't make any sense. So you'd actually get an error thrown by Cypress saying doesn't know what you mean by next, because this expression here evaluates to an array. Okay, next, so it doesn't take any argument because you're always just saying find the next element according to the HTML for the current page. The EQ or equals command, uh, I'm saying it gets the nth DOM element. I suppose if we look at the example first, right? See where that get input. So let's supposing this returns, let's supposing there are a number of text boxes on the current page. So see where that get input will return an array referring where each element in the array is pointing at a text box element on the page. And I'm interested in the third text box. So it starts at index 0. So EQ2 will pick out the third text box from that array. And then looks like I'm interacting with that text box. I want to type this text into that text box. So that's the EQ command. Again, you'd only use it you only use it when you chain it on to something that precedes it, which doesn't have to be get, but it typically is. Here's another example. I want to get all the LI elements currently on the page, and I want to pick out the fifth one. And I'm making an assertion here in this case. I'm asserting, sorry, that the text within that fifth LI element is this text here. So as I said, I'm just documenting some of the commands and I'm giving you examples of using those commands, but there are many others. And on the next slide, I'm just giving you the URL within the Cypress documentation where you can get, a list of all of the commands. Now, I'm not expecting you to go reading up on this stuff because there are far too many commands to go just reading down through this document, be too dry really. But hopefully when you work your way through this week's lab, and the purpose of the lab really from my perspective is to give you lots of examples of these commands so that you just learn it that way really. Learn by example rather than learn by reading the documentation. But you may need to go back to the documentation if you want to get more specific information on a particular command. Now, that's the command. Within the commands, many of the commands expect a selector as an argument, where the selector specifies the type of DOM elements that you're trying to access. And the selector comes in many different forms. And so I'm documenting the different forms or the different types of selectors that you can use. The one that we've seen so far is where the selector is just specifying a HTML tag type like button or paragraph or H1, H2, that kind of idea. So when the selector is just something like this, right, then Cypress interprets this as being a HTML tag and it goes looking through, essentially goes looking through the DOM data structure to find the elements that are of this type and it returns back the array if it is an array or the single element if it is just a single element, a reference to that DOM element. So that's HTML tags. Alternatively, you may actually know the ID of the element. And in that case, you would just have a hash symbol at the beginning of the selector followed by the ID itself. And of course, we know that element IDs are unique. So certainly this expression will only return one element. Or you may specify the selector by giving the CSS class that the element or elements have. And when it's a CSS class, then you start with the dot character and then the actual CSS class itself. Now I'm using get here in all of the examples, but if I just go back to, let's say find, find takes a selector as well. So you can use these selectors um, in other commands other than the get command. The contains command doesn't expect a selector, that expects just a text string. Um, and EQ doesn't expect a selector, that just expects an integer. Next doesn't take a selector, but there are other commands that take selectors as well. Back to my selectors. So HTML tag, element ID, CSS class, or if you can specify really any attribute of an element. CSS is one attribute, but it can have other elements can have other attributes as well. And so, for example, let's supposing there's a button on the web page. Let's supposing there are a number of buttons on a web page, but only one of the buttons has an attribute called type, and the value assigned to that attribute is submit. So I want to pick out the button that has this particular attribute setting. And so this is the syntax that I use. I start with the HTML tag type, and then within square brackets, I specify the attribute name and the attribute value. All right. And just to complete it, this is actually how you click a button, so if you wanted to do that, that's the method that you use. This is not a command, this is actually an interaction type method. There's also the ent child selector. How does that work? Well, okay. Strictly speaking, I suppose it's not a selector, but just the example, maybe supposing you've got a table on the current web page and you want to pick out a particular cell, and the cell can be specified in terms of what row and what column does that cell appear in. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm first of all getting the actual table element within the page, and then I'm finding all of the TR elements, that's the rows within my table. And then I'm using the EQ to pick it out the ent child within this array, if you like. So strictly speaking, this is not a selector, but it's still a very useful thing. So this entire expression now from here to here, that is going to pick out one column within my table. And so I'm finding all of the columns within this row, and then I'm picking out one of the columns. So that's a nice example of A, meta chaining, B, kind of navigating. That's a term I could have used earlier on, actually. Essentially, what we're kind of doing here is we're navigating through the network of DOM elements that make up our web page. If I go back to here, let's say, similar kind of navigation going on here. And as well, there is navigation going on here. You're starting off with the form element, and then you're navigating down into the selector element within that form element, and so on. Jumping around a little bit too much maybe for you. So that's in it. That's some examples of selectors. I guess these are the main selectors. As I've already said, arguably this really isn't a selector, but it's still a technique that we use quite a lot. And I'm saying down at the bottom here that the selectors can be combined. Right. So if you take this example here, the way you interpret this is I'm looking for a div element or an element whose tag type is div. But in particular, I'm looking for a div that has the CSS class called container, because the dot always means a CSS class. So I'm looking for a div element that has the container CSS class uh, assigned to it. Okay. And you'll see some examples of combining. I mean, we're combining here as well. We're combining attributes and a tag here as well. Right. So I've written my test specs. How do I run them? Um, well, the first thing, the way you run them is by using the npx cypress, either the npx cypress open command or the npx cypress run command. But what I'm highlighting here is the fact that your tests actually run inside a browser tab. Okay. And so if that's the case, then you can actually within your test code, you've got full access to everything within the browser environment. Like you can access cookies, you can access the DOM, certainly. That's what we're mainly doing inside in our test code is accessing the DOM and manipulating it and interacting with it. But you can access the cookies part area within the browser environment. You can access local storage within the browser environment. You can access these resources, as they're called, within your um, test spec code. Also, Cypress, I'm saying here, is web app framework agnostic. So it doesn't matter whether you've developed your web app using React or Angular or Vue or any of those other frameworks that are comparable to React. Um, Cypress doesn't care what you use because, as you've seen so far, Cypress is really all about manipulating the browser's DOM data structure, and that's the same as right across all of the frameworks. Uh, Flake freeness. What's nice about Cypress is that essentially every time you could take these two together, every time you run your Cypress test code, you're going to get the same result. Now, that wasn't always the case. Certainly when we were using the Selenium framework, which predates Cypress, because I've already mentioned that the nature of an end-to-end application is that there is a lot of asynchronous, there's an asynchronous nature to it, right? And so that did tend to cause a lot of problems in the early days of certainly web app testing. You would tend to get a different result because it might be slow when you run, your browser might react slowly. The first time you ran your tests, it might be a little bit quicker the next time. So it was kind of not deterministic really. And it wasn't repeatable. You wouldn't get the same result every single time. Whereas Cypress has a number of techniques built into it, which I will mention at the end of this slide set, which allows it to ensure that your test execution is completely deterministic. It's repeatable. You get the exact same result every time. It's consistent. You get the same result. As I said, these kind of mean the same things, I guess. But auto retries, well, I'll explain these maybe points a little bit later on. Um, Deals with asynchronous. Yeah, all of these are kind of referring to the same characteristic of Cypress, which made Cypress much better than its predecessor. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay. As usual, I don't get as far as I expect, but let's keep going anyway. So this is how you start up your Cypress, start up the Cypress runner, I guess, if you like. In particular, we're starting up the interactive runner. Um, let's see. Okay, what I'll do just is switch over to VS Code. What you're seeing here is the Movies app that you've been developing in Web App Dev 2. Now, uh, it may not be an exact replica of what you have been developing in this module with Roseanne and the other guys, but it's close enough anyway. And so if I just start up this app using npm run dev, and if I browse to it, it's running on localhost 3000, and this all looks familiar to you. Yeah, and it behaves pretty much close enough anyway to what you've been developing. So if I select the more info here, brings me to the detail page and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's the Movies app. And up here, I've got my Cypress folder. And inside the E2E folder, I've got a number of test specs. So if I want to run these tests, according to my slides, I've got to run this command here at the very top from the command line. So if I open up a second terminal session, because I want to leave my my React development server running. So I'll open up a second terminal. And I'll go npx cypress open. Note it's npx, not npm. And you can see here on the left, right, it's running what's called the Cypress GUI or graphical user interface. Okay, and that's what you see here. And so you can actually use Cypress to do component testing as well as end-to-end testing, but we're only interested in the end-to-end testing side of it. So if I select that, I do have the option of running my Cypress tests in different browser environments. That would certainly be an issue if you want to make sure your application works in different environments. But for now, we're just interested in the Chrome environment. So we select that and we click on this. Now, what it has done now is it has actually opened up a completely new instance of the Chrome browser. And so, you can see here, right, that I've got a Chrome here on the extreme left, and I've got another Chrome instance, or do I? Oh yeah, there, right. So the Chrome instance that I'm focused on there now is the Chrome instance that I started up myself. You know, that's where let's say I loaded up the module's web page. The other Chrome instance is the Chrome instance that's running my Cypress tests, or it's the environment for the execution of my Cypress tests. My Cypress tests haven't actually run yet. I can control which tests I want to run because we are using the interactive version of the Cypress runner, if you like. And so what is listing here are the different spec files. So these 4 spec files, they correspond to, the 4 files that I've got inside here. And so if I run one of them by just clicking on it, you can see it's actually flicking through the execution. That's what you saw happening here. If I run it again, can I rerun it? Right. So that flickering that's going on the right of the screen is essentially my test spec code um, interacting the with my movies app. Yeah. Now I need to walk through the code, but here's the code. Not going to get time now to talk through it today. I'm going to have to do it tomorrow. But the very first thing essentially it does is it visits the root path and then it starts playing with the DOM. Okay. Right. So I am definitely going to need at least certainly 1 hour, if not 2 hours tomorrow, I think, to get through the remainder of these slides because my objective is to finish lecturing this week. Uh, and also tomorrow, I will give ye, if I go back to which is the browsers, this one. Okay, we've got a specification for assignment two, and assignment two incorporates CI/CD pipelines and end-to-end testing as well. So there's a lot I need to get through with you tomorrow, really. And it's looks like it's certainly going to take could well take 2 hours for me to work my way through it. But I'd like to finish the lecturing with you this week if I could. Give you some space to do my assignment and other assignments as well, maybe during next week. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if anybody has any questions that they want to ask me. A little bit too late for that, I'd say. No. Okay. So I will put a link up on Slack for tomorrow's lecture and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye bye now.